Hello and welcome to Pen in Paradise, Episode 2. Today we'll continue our journey into the Elder Scrolls V, Skyrim. We'll talk about the game's interactions with the player in more detail. That includes combat, shouts and special abilities, using and abusing magic, and monsters and dragons. Everyone loves the dragons. The first thing to note about Skyrim is that you always have access to at least 3 actions at once. Even if you run through the woods clad only in a loincloth punching the wildlife, you'll still have 2 attacks and a special ability, or as I call them, lefty, righty, and shouty. No, I'm not making that up. You'll have independent left and right fists, and you can shout things to death. This helps keep combat interesting and visceral, since there's no setup which doesn't involve you actively maneuvering, selecting from a few active options, and choosing the best one in mere fractions of seconds. Favorites and hotkeys help you choose loadouts quickly, without going into the somewhat clunky menu system, so you can swiftly change from flicking fireballs to hacking with battle axes. The menu system unfortunately doesn't live up to the rest of the game. There's nothing quite as epic action-breaking as pausing everything, hopping into a text screen, and gulping potions one by one. What's worse is that it isn't just designed somewhat poorly, but that items are scattered and hard to find. You'll often find yourself jumping into the wrong section, or trying to skim through a huge pile of things looking for exactly what you want. And of course your ebony arrows are not in the same section as daedric arrows, which are not next to glass arrows. Still, that doesn't detract from the gleeful fun of maneuvering into range, decapitating one enemy, and jumping back before his allies can strike, or dashing from cover to cover and trading spells, or sneaking up behind someone and cutting a throat. Combat's a blast no matter what your playstyle, even if, like me, you enjoy testing all sorts of weapons and magic. This pulse-pounding excitement is where the game really shines. Combat's not only fast and engaging, it makes you pay attention. Even weaker enemies can do some damage, and stronger ones can hurt you very badly, very quickly. Fortunately, you have more than a few tricks to use right back at them. Special abilities deserve extra attention. Most of the game's special abilities are shouts. Now these can do almost anything, but always directed at a specific target or area. Shouts can freeze an opponent solid, provide a brief distraction while sneaking, or create a wave of force that shoves enemies back. The latter can be the game's most devastating attack, in fact, because very little short of a dragon can resist it, and shoving anything off a cliff is virtually a guaranteed instant kill. Shouts are most often used in combat, and include a number of simple attacks. Dragon shouts are also the ones you'll use over and over because they're the only special abilities that you can use over and over. Dragon shouts all have a cooldown time, and it's different for each one, but once they recharge, you're good to go again, and that usually takes place in, say, 15 seconds to a minute. Skyrim has plenty of situational or specialized ability as well, and many of these are racial. Every race gets at least one, and some of these are so powerful as to break the system. An Imperial, for example, can casually walk up, chop someone's head off with a battle axe, use a calming effects, and then continue decapitating everyone else in sight as those poor people merrily saunter along their way. But you don't have to stop there. You can become a werewolf and claw your enemies to death. Or you could gain the super special awesome thief ability to, suddenly and for no apparent reason, cause all your enemies to start fighting each other. I categorically deny that I have ever imagined myself using the last one while reclining on a couch, wearing a toga, and ordering my gladiators to fight to the death for my amusement, while a nubile young slave girl feeds me grapes. It has never happened. Not once. You'll have to wait a day and go rest for other abilities to recharge, and that model works less and less well in the 3D era. It made much more sense when the action was farther away, like in the old isometric games, and when characters have a whole suite of similar effects, like Dungeons & Dragons, Fantasy, and Magic. It doesn't make much sense when applied to a handful of powers like these. They're great fun, but they should use recharging as well, even though they might have a separate recharge meter all to themselves. It could be a long recharge, but doing this would make much more sense and keep with the same flow as the shouts. It wouldn't change any of the individual battles in the game, but it does mean that characters can try out new tactics and use these new tricks more often. Still, the use of shouts and special abilities integrates very well into the game overall, so this doesn't amount to a huge problem. Shouts in particular have so many varied effects that you can always find one suitable for your character, and finding new ones is going to be a huge motive when playing the game. The use of magic presents more challenges and opportunities. Like weapons, you can now dual-wield spells, casting one in each hand. This makes magic more invigorating in battle, as well as opening up many interesting combinations of spells to try. You can shoot fireballs in one hand while shielding in the other, or summoning up spirits to defend you, while also casting frostbolts at people. However, magic as a whole isn't as well balanced as it might be. Many spells don't do much, or require too many perks to really be useful. Mana requirements have jumped dramatically, so you practically need certain lines of perks in each tree to reduce that cost so you can use the spells. This makes playing a generalist mage much more difficult, although not impossible. If you like to jump around and try out many magical spells like me, you'll inevitably start having a hard time keeping up with the mana costs, and you can master spells well in excess of your available magic. Despite this, spells all have specific individual textures to them which really improves their play. Each one has its own feel, composed of sight, sound, and an almost tactile level of feedback, often contributed by special effects on the surroundings. For example, fireballs create explosions that really knock things about. Frost magic slows and weakens the enemy, while lightning drains their magic. These combine to make spells feel as real as swords, so you can play the mage and still get a powerful feeling of making your mark in the world. And it's not limited just to destruction spells. Other spells have a similar punch. The two real disappointments are the loss of spellmaking, an Elder Scrolls staple, and the loss of all utility magic. The two problems combine to significantly reduce the fun I got out of playing a mage. You won't find one way in the game to speed yourself up, fly, or jump. You can use a dragon shout to knock foes back, but not regular magic. You can heal yourself, but you can't make yourself stronger. All in all, the effects presented are very useful and good, but they're also very limited. And since you can no longer create your own custom spells, that means the loss of my favorite personal creation, Frostfire. Ironically, there's no real point to dropping spellmaking. The big problem with it was that some low-level effects could be reduced so low that you could chain cast to become a master overnight. However, the new system gives you skill advancement for using spells effectively, not just repeatedly casting them. So not only do many of the fans feel the loss, it wouldn't break the system now anyway, and that just makes it a little worse. However, the quality picks up again with monsters. Skyrim sports a good array of monstrous foes to smack around. While somewhat short in variety, they each have individual forms of movement, appearance, and behavior, which makes each critter distinct and interesting. Bears don't act like saber cats, who don't act like get giants or mammoths, who don't act like wolves. Human-like enemies come in wider variety than the others, as you may find swordsmen, tough shield users, spellcasters, and archers. However, melee combat gets overused. It's still quite fun, but when the vast majority of enemies simply rush you immediately, you may start to get bored. Some more variety would have done very well here. Melee enemies tend to lack any interesting things to spice it up. A handful of undead, who are basically human enemies as well, they use the same AI and tricks, can use shouts, but I would have appreciated it if some of the human enemies had their own special abilities. Likewise, the game lacks several obvious categories of foes which have appeared a lot in other Elder Scrolls titles. I've yet to meet one wizard who took the obvious route and wore armor, even though you can yourself. Melee enemies not only lack those interesting abilities, but often don't seem to use their swords effectively, although I do see some that dual-wield weapons. Perhaps worse, almost every spellcaster also uses the same basic magical attacks you do, so there's rarely any mystery about what powers they can bring to bear or how they're going to use them. Finally, spirits, ghosts, and various extraplanar critters like Daedra do exist, but they're all very, very rare. The game thus wastes a lot of character models that you'll see here, and they're really cool, and these are some of the most intriguing monster designs in the game. Dragons deserve their own props because they're not only extremely fun and work extremely well in the game, but they're one of the major selling points and advertising points of Elder Scrolls V. Dragons aren't the usual sort of random monster out in the wilderness. You could fight one anywhere, and they come hunting for you. Dragons have oodles of hit points, several forms of attack, and their own behaviors. They'll fly high and circle around, strafe the battlefield, and generally make a nuisance of themselves. Given their literal firepower, health, and mobility, fighting a dragon might seem suicidal. Fortunately, they'll have to take a few breaks themselves, giving you time to recover. But until you get used to them and find some techniques tailored to kill them, facing down dragons will be the most epic and difficult battles in the game. For some reason, dragons don't like to use shouts despite that being a major plot point for nearly every part of the main quest line. The mission becomes even more curious when you realize that they do use Fire Breath or Frost Breath abilities in a way, just not any other shouts, no matter how useful. Ideally, every dragon would have had its own shouts, randomly chosen from those useful in battle, and use them whenever appropriate. Not only would have this been wickedly cool, it would have covered the one problem of dragon battles: they're a little too predictable. Because all dragons have the same AI, they all use the same attack pattern, and you'll pretty rapidly come to understand exactly how to defeat them. Still, that's only a small problem. Dragons might not be a huge challenge once you've got your retainer with full ebony armor, an enchanted weapon to hit them with, and a summoned creature. But to get there, you've got a long road and a lot of fun battles along the way, plus many, many shouts to try out, and killing dragons is the only way to learn new shouts. Now, in Oblivion, Bethesda introduced the concept of level scaling. Now, this actually existed in Morrowind, but because it was much weaker, it wasn't nearly as important, and just was a minor tweak on the game. The level scaling in Skyrim stands out as a huge, vast improvement over Oblivion. Interestingly, this works better in two ways. Oblivion had a problem because every enemy would scale right to your level. Combat was as always too hard for characters who didn't focus on it, too easy for those who levered every advantage, and often really dull because the difficulty was just always exactly the same. Skyrim introduces an idea borrowed from Bethesda's own Fallout 3 and places every area in its own level range. A weak dungeon might only scale up to level 15, and no matter how far you go past that, you'll never face more challenge than the level 15 character. A high-level dungeon might start at level 30, and even if you're level 4, you'll face the same challenge as a level 30 character. Surprisingly, this works even better than anticipated. I had the fun of romping around mashing weak foes when I needed to, and challenge of carefully defeating dungeons too strong for me when I wanted to. Even better, I never felt completely outclassed by enemies, because the array of spells and abilities you get makes it harder than ever to find yourself really helpless. Now once you beat the monsters, you'll have your loot to sell. We covered the problems with the looting system before, but it's worth mentioning that you really won't find much interesting in there. Part of that is because the best stuff is all made by you. A skilled smith can virtually double the effectiveness of armor, while enchanters place mighty boosts on gear. You'll find enchanted stuff, but not improved smith's gear while you're out in the wilderness, but generally speaking, all of the enchantments you do find aren't nearly as good as what you can eventually manage. You'll find potion ingredients by the bushel, and the most powerful potions, too, can replace any skill or ability you need. In fact, the only problem with crafting is that it lacks some of the staples. Similar to the problem with magic, the game dropped many of the more interesting tricks. That doesn't mean less firepower. Any of these is well worth your time to master, but it does make the game less interesting. For example, many people like making their characters super fast, but you won't find the boots of blinding speed in Skyrim. Others wanted to make their characters invulnerable. In short, breaking the system with magic or crafting wasn't a bug, it was a feature. It wasn't about tipping the scales in your favor, but doing something utterly absurd and silly. To me, this is the one and perhaps only real problem in Skyrim. At times they forget that the open-world RPGs exist so the character can break it, and preferably humiliate it. You're not fighting so much against the monsters or bandits as against the system itself, and players feel real accomplishment when they do beat that system, just as a gambler in Vegas who beats the house feels pride and joy in that victory. With that, our look into the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim concludes. But where does the series go from here? Allow me to suggest that the next Elder Scrolls should take place in the provinces of Elsweyr and Valenwood. There are three reasons for this. First, they haven't been deeply explored before. Sure, we've looked at Morrowind, we've looked at the Imperial Province of Cyrodiil, we've looked at the savage land of the Nords, but we've never gotten into the steaming jungles of the Green Pact, or the harsh deserts and badlands of the Khajiit. Second, both of these provinces have, in Elder Scrolls history, been invaded by the Thalmor, and the Thalmor, as arrogant elf Nazi overlords, are really fun to kill. Third, the Khajiit are known to use martial arts styles, and these could be a good stand-in for the Dragon Shout system. Now, they probably won't want to reuse the Dragon Shout system, but having schools of martial arts with little quest lines to learn, get introduced to and master would be a good way to keep the special abilities system while putting it into a different context and opening up all kinds of new tricks that you can use. I would also recommend that they expand the quest lines and really force players to earn their victory, not just through difficulty, but by truly earning their status as the greatest thief or the mightiest warrior or some other form of hero before they take their place as the head of the Fighters Guild or the master of the mages or whatever organizations are in it. And of course, it might be a little different with martial arts schools or something of that nature. I would also recommend that they alter the stealing system. Now, the concept that I have in mind is a little complicated, but in short, it would be based on suspicion, not on whether people see you stealing something exactly, although obviously that's a part of it. Instead, you would be having to hide your tracks so that no one even knows that you did some sort of terrible, terrible stealing. And too great or too greedy a theft might earn you a bounty even if no one saw you do it. In short, what I really have in mind is a system where players have a certain starting point, and then they must try to sneak over to whatever it is they want to steal, at least for any big or major thefts, take the item or items, and then get out of there. This will turn any major theft into its own little adventure, created when and where the player wants it. It would also be interesting to see if we couldn't have weaknesses for every strength. This would allow the player, as the more active party with more equipment or gear and abilities to use, to tailor what they take into a dungeon, or fort, or whatever, to the weaknesses they expect the enemies to have in it. If you know that a Thalmor fortress is going to be filled with heavily armored mages, you could take weapons that are more effective against heavy armor, and then, of course, equip yourself with the same spells and abilities that might be more effective against mages. Now, the latter might not be much different than in Skyrim, but the former would, and would open up a much deeper level of tactical thinking for players who like to use melee combat, but want to do something a little bit more than just bash something with a really big, sharp, pointy thing. In any case, this concludes Pen in Paradise, Episode 2, The Elder Scrolls V, Skyrim. We hope you've enjoyed it, and that you'll come back for all your gaming analysis needs. I'm currently planning a series on the origins of gaming, and how a Prussian general is responsible for all of Dungeons & Dragons. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got a few dragons to slay.